I'm delighted to have as our guest today Dr. David DeWitt. He's been going to give a presentation and the keynote on data warehousing in the cloud. I'm personally really excited about that. I've attended PASS for a number of years now, and it's always been a highlight of the event for me. So I'll let Dr. DeWitt introduce himself, and then we'll have plenty to talk about, I'm sure.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I don't know that I've ever starred in a podcast before, so I'm thrilled and honored to be invited. I'm also super excited about returning to SQL Pass. As many of the previous attendees know, I fully intended, as did Rima, to make last year's the last Pass keynote because I basically run out of ideas, having done 7 or 8 going back to the fall of 2008. And then one day this spring, I realized exactly what talk to give. And that's this talk I'm going to be giving this year on data warehousing in the cloud. As a bit of background, I was a professor at the University of Wisconsin for 32 years before starting a small research and development lab for Microsoft in Madison. I did that for 8 years, and then I moved to Boston this fall. But going back to the very beginnings of my time as an assistant professor in the mid-70s, I've worked in the area of parallel database systems. And in 2008, I gave a keynote that talked about the fundamentals of parallel database systems. And that was sort of driven in part by my expertise in the area and also in part by the timely acquisition of Data Allegro, which has since become SQL Server, PDW, and then Microsoft APS. It keeps morphing its name every couple of months. I realized in thinking about what I might talk about this year, I realized that the world had really changed. And whereas in the past, a scalable data warehouse such as Microsoft APS or Teradata could only be acquired in a appliance form factor or roll your own by buying a bunch of servers and installing them. Now, multiple vendors are offering data warehousing services in the cloud. And I think this is a real revolution. And I realized that I could sort of talk about why that revolution is happening, a little bit about the background that goes into building a scalable data warehouse or parallel database system, and then talk about 3 of the main competitors. So I'm really, once I got the idea for this talk, even though I knew my time at Microsoft was coming to a close, I was really excited to do it. And I literally have been working on this keynote since July, and maybe I should be working harder or I'd be done, but I'm super excited to be back. I love giving past keynotes. It's like a drug you're addicted to. The audience is wonderful. So anyways, I hope that this talk will be something that people enjoy hearing.
Yes, I think that they will. I know when they broke the news that you were coming back, everyone was just super excited. I could see in Twitter seemed to light up, and SQL family, lots of lovely tweets. So I was really thrilled myself that you were coming back, and it was lovely to see the response from the past community as well. So I'm really excited about the keynote, and I think it's a really interesting angle you're taking to look at the fundamental parallel database techniques and how they look and how they sit next to one another. So I think it's something I think many organisations struggle with a little bit. There's almost so much out there, particularly in big data. It feels that it's hard for people to know where to start. I don't know if that's something you've come across with your experience with Microsoft. Is that a sort of conversation that customers have?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of confusion because I think I think as I'll talk about this, there are a bunch of factors driving the explosion in data warehousing, and the low cost of storage and compute really is one of the key factors. But I think, what brought it to the forefront of the community and is the advent of Hadoop. And Reem and I talked about Hadoop a few years ago. And I think that really, the availability of very low cost in terms of acquisition, software, free software, with a maintenance charge that could handle massive amounts of data really was what tipped the world into data warehousing for big data. And I think, it was a combination of low-cost storage and the realization people could just go stand up a Hadoop cluster and start analyzing their big data, whether it be with Hadoop distribution or now with Spark, or with a more traditional data warehousing offering, either in the appliance form factor, or a software form factor, or the cloud. But I think it's important, and maybe because I'm a bigoted kind of SQL person, that I think a few years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, Mike Stoneberg and I wrote a blog post about MapReduce, titled MapReduce, A Giant Step Backwards. And I think that blog post generated a lot of hate mail and a lot of hate tweets. But in fact, we were really right. Nobody wants to write MapReduce jobs, and everybody wants to write SQL. If you look at the trend in terms of Spark, there's Spark SQL or Hive, HiveQL. Everybody wants SQL, and I think people get confused about the ability of a traditional solution like SQL Server, APS, or SQL DW, or Redshift from Amazon versus a open source solution like Spark and HiveQL. There are key technology differences, and I think the fact that there are free, quote unquote, free solutions in terms of acquisition, maybe not in terms of maintenance or overhead of using, has sort of confused the field as to which is the most cost effective. And I think the advent of standard SQL data warehousing products like SQL DW and Redshift and Snowflake, which I'll also talk about in this keynote, I think people will quickly realize that those are the best solutions to use. But let me add one other thing, because I like to talk. Yes, those tweets were nice, but I'm sure people are sitting there saying, oh, why is it DeWitt? We'd rather have Rima. There would have been much more excited tweets if Rima were coming back to talk. And maybe we can encourage her to come back next year, because she truly is an extraordinary speaker, and I live in fear of having to measure up against a Rima talk. So I'm a little bit worried about that. Anyway, sorry for that diversion.
That's okay. I've loved both of your keynotes, when Rima talks and when you talk. I think I find both of you really inspirational, especially I think in terms of blazing the way in terms of where the industry's going, because I'm a business intelligence person, and the customers will say to me, I've got all these problems with data, but I'm not really sure where to go or what to do. They just know that they have reports which no longer meet the business requirements, and they know they're collecting all of this other data somewhere, but they don't know how to really make the value of it. So I think what I get from your keynotes is really messages that I can take back to the customer to say, well, actually, here's a very clear way of explaining the technology that's out there. I think businesses are starting to learn that they have all of this data. There's value in it, but it feels that they're not quite sure where to start. And a lot of the terminology can be quite difficult if you're not a technical person. It's hard to go and ask your boss or to get a business case for something that you don't really understand. And I think that's what I get from your keynotes, is that very much I can show that to a customer and show that to somebody who is struggling to understand the technology estate and say, you know what, right, I get this now. I don't need to write a MapReduce job in Java to understand what I need to ask for. And I think that really helps me personally. And I think you've made an important point, I think, about people struggling to learn to learn Java and MapReduce when they've been so accustomed to SQL for such a long period of time. In terms of PASS, we do try and make sure our technical education is all about different ways of analysing data. That could be in Hive, for example. And I think SQL is such a great language, and it's also a great springboard into learning these other big data analytics as well.
Well, I also think that, if you look back on the field of relational database systems. Many systems were used primarily for business processing or business processes. And I think data warehousing was really, because of the cost of entry with appliances like Oracle RAC or Teradata traditionally, the cost of entry was very high. And I think, the combination of developers and DBAs not having experience with data warehousing was driven by these two factors, that most business processes were about transactional data and the cost of entry was high to get into a scalable data warehouse. And I think as we go forward, and again, I look back on my 2008 keynote, which was all about sort of high-end data warehousing in an appliance form factor, and think about how low how low the barrier of entry is with a offering like SQL DW or Redshift or Snowflake. I think people will take advantage of their SQL knowledge and will take advantage of these low-cost cloud offerings. And I think the combination of SQL and low cost will really open up the opportunity for a large number of companies to do a better job of exploiting the value of all the data that they maintain, that they acquire and store. And I think the other thing, and I bring this up in the keynote, is that if you look at the cost of storage in a offering like Azure or an offering like AWS S3, the cost of storage in the cloud is just phenomenally low. And this again will allow more companies to take advantage of the data, to keep and take advantage, exploit the data that they do have. So I think that's why I got so excited about doing this keynote. Once I realized what keynote I could give that I hope the community would be excited about, I was like all in to do this keynote. And again, it's like, can you live up to the expectations of the past community? And people should realize there's a ton of pressure. If you've done something well, the last thing you want to do is come back and bomb, especially if you think it's your last one. So there's a ton of pressure, and I hope people appreciate that. The other thing people should appreciate is I never rehearse these talks. Reem and I never rehearse any of our talks, and that's very different than the other executive keynotes, which they spend a lot of time rehearsing. It is just sort of an interesting sidelight people might find interesting is that when I was an assistant professor, I used to rehearse my talks before I'd go to conferences, and I found that I would make mistakes during the practice talk, and then when it came to give the real talk, I would remember those mistakes, and it really impeded the quality of the talks. But after teaching classes for 30 years, you never prepare your lectures and review your lectures. I just have gone into all these past keynotes cold, so I never know how long they're going to be. I always sort of guess on how many slides to use. I know I use a lot, but there is a ton of pressure. And as I said earlier, the SQL past community, I love them dearly, and it means the world to me to make sure I do a good job on these things. So, but I really do. I think going back to your question, I think data warehousing was not traditionally a major focus of most businesses, and because of the cost of entry. And I think the fact that with SQL is a language that everyone understands, and the various BI tools that generate great SQL gets to data warehousing. We can use data warehousing to drive the development of machine learning models. So I think it is really, this is a revolution we're going to see. And I think we're going to look back at this period as the beginning of the democratization of data warehousing, and the cloud is going to drive that.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and I know customers sometimes will say to me, "What should I do with my existing data warehouse? Should I just get rid of it? What should I do with my existing SQL Server?" And I tend to say to them, "No, don't throw out what you have. You've already spent a lot of time and effort on it, but you can use both." And you can start to use them together. I don't know if that's something that you see people asking you about. I certainly get that question sometimes. Should I switch off SQL Server? And I say, no, don't do that. It's actually, just that your ecosystem is changing and growing and developing to match what your data is doing over time, because we live in a very volatile world in terms of data. It's growing so quickly, it's changing shape.
Yes, and I think, I think you're absolutely right. I think there will be always a place for certain data warehouses to be on-prem. I think as we demonstrate how seriously Microsoft and every other company takes security and privacy through encryption, I think customers will increasingly become comfortable with moving more and more of their mission critical data to the cloud. But as you say, the right solution may be a hybrid on-prem cloud solution. We offer that with SQL Server now on-prem to the cloud. Actually, we called it internally stretched DB. I forget what the name of the product is currently. But I think one can envision a on-prem data warehousing solution for recent data and a cloud data warehousing solution for historical data, and so that you can take advantage of low-cost storage. Right now, I would say there are no good solutions that would take for example, a SQL Server / Microsoft APS appliance and connect it to the cloud in terms of SQL DW. And I think, we'll see if customers demand that, I think we'll see companies emerge with products that allow a great data warehousing, scalable data warehousing experience on-prem to the cloud. But I agree with you. I think people should not abandon SQL Server. They certainly shouldn't abandon SQL Server for Spark or Hive from any vendor. They're used to the semantics of SQL, the rich data types, and the robust query optimizer. And none of these other products have that kind of history in terms of long-term stable code that performs really well. And so, yes, customers should definitely not be abandoning their SQL Server. And I think just they need to look as they develop new applications and collect additional data, where's the best place to do the processing, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud or eventually in a hybrid solution.
Yeah, I think it also gives people options as well. I think that's what I love about the cloud personally, is it gives people a whole ton of options and different ways to look at reducing their costs or adding additional functionality. So just a small example, I've been working with the NHS, the National Health Service here in the UK, and some of the researchers will use R in order to analyse data, in order to do some medical research. And then I could say to them, well, actually, you're using R, but we can use that with SQL Server. It's now embedded, and we've got this thing, our services, and then we can start to stretch that to the cloud. And so I think I'm starting to see a bit of a trend where people who are open source are now coming into the Microsoft ecosystem and saying, hang on a minute, I can store more data here. And for that person who wants to do a lot of R, I think they actually are quite happy to take their data to the cloud because they look at it and think, oh, look at all that space for all that data, and I can only have more of it. And if there's anything data geeks love, it's more and more data, I think.
Yes, and I agree with you. I think the integration of SQL Server and R is really an exciting first step to bring R closer and closer to your business data. And I think, right now, there is no integration of R and SQL DW. I think, that's a really exciting area that I presume Microsoft is working on. Again, since I don't work for Microsoft anymore, I don't know what the product plans are, but I think the widespread interest in the integration of R and SQL Server will probably drive the company to do a integration with SQL DW or Microsoft APS/PDW over time. But I think that's really R is to data analysts as SQL is to us database practitioners, and I think bringing those two worlds together was really a stroke of genius on the part of the SQL management.
I wholeheartedly agree. I really do. It's really exciting to see things in data which you couldn't see before. And it can really even change lives, particularly with the medical research and things. It's just so fantastic. I really love the whole cloud concept, and I love seeing what it can do for customers. I think if I was to recommend someone at university at the moment or just starting their career in technology, I'd probably recommend cloud, and looking at these technologies such as the parallel database techniques is a real stroke of genius in terms of a career move. I wondered if you'd agree with that, or if you've any thoughts on advice for that person.
Well, I'm, as a long-term academic, I'm still a believer. I agree with you. I think it's important, and I saw this before I left the university that, machine learning really exploded in terms of curriculum offerings. But I think, good fundamentals in the whole breadth of computer science remains very important. I think understanding, how operating systems work, understanding how database systems work, taking classes in data structures, even understanding theoretical limits through a theory course. I think a broad computer science curriculum for someone starting out is really important to establish, to give you the foundation of that you'll need throughout your career. I mean, I myself, I went through undergraduate in the late 60s and graduate school in the early 70s, and there are whole fields that are missing from my background. I never had a networking class because back in the 70s, networking was a very specialized field, and we didn't have things like Ethernet or TCP/IP, so there are big holes in my background that I wish I had filled during graduate school. But I think, the field has matured a lot, and I think broad education across a wide area, even if you're really interested in statistics or databases, understanding the other key technologies that go into our field. It's like, what are the implications of having remote storage? You need to understand a little bit about the networking stack, things like TCP/IP, the performance limits of Ethernet as a networking technology. So I think there is broad brush, but I agree with you. Knowing R and knowing a little bit about machine learning is really critical for any undergraduate or graduate student in today's job market. Absolutely critical.
That's great advice. Thank you very much. Well, we've come to the end of our time, and I just wanted to say thank you so much. It's been my absolute privilege to speak to you, and I can't wait for the keynote as well. And with that, I would like to say a goodbye to our listeners, and we'll wrap up there.
Well, thank you for having me. As I said, this is the first time I've ever done this. And again, I hope to see everyone at SQL Pass. I'm sorry I'm not Rima. I hope the bloggers and tweeters will be kind to me. And I want to assure everyone that I've done my very best to bring you a great keynote in under 2 weeks now. We're under 2 weeks. And anyway, we'll see you, everybody, at SQL Pass. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your kind words about the community. We're absolutely delighted to have you, and I can't wait. And I think it's going to be a great session. And thank you so much for all your hard work and efforts and your contribution to PASS. And we're just really excited to have you on board. So thank you very much.